live so that this can be recorded. Um, so, I mean, I find it very exciting when you have people from different sort of cultural contexts getting together to review products of culture, music and films. And um, so, really, the first question then, maybe I'd start with the three of you and then come to Subi, is was this the first time you were looking at writing by an Indian author on the environment for young people? And what were the sort of first thoughts that came to you about the writing and the reading experience involved in that? Maybe we'd go with Rebecca.
Hi. Yeah, this was kind of one of the first children's books I'd read by an Indian author. Although I previously did read a book called Asher and the Spirit Bird, which is by Jasbinder Bilan, who I believe was born in India and then grew up in the UK. And that kind of has that very strong setting in the Himalayas, and that kind of the landscape is such an important part of that narrative, even if like the eco theme isn't as strong as I think it was in the book we've just read for this dialogue.
That's interesting. What about you, Charlie?
Yes, this is my first Indian authored children's book, and I think I gave a little sneak peek, but I loved the colour and the life of Mumbai that came through. Like literally in the opening chapter, like really diving into the culture was like, I'm there, I can smell it, I can hear it, I'm fully involved in it. And I thought then the way that Cozy Castle was used to create such a community of a bigger macrocosm in a very micro environment was really, really well done, and a great, like, digestible introduction to a whole wonderful world. So yeah, enjoyed
And
it.
Sarah?
I've read a few other environmentally led books. And then I've read Haroon and the Sea of Stories by Salman Rushdie. But this was my first bringing together of an environmental story with taking place in India. And I really enjoyed it.
So what I sort of broadly gather is that this is the first time all three of you have actually read a children's book by an Indian author that has been published in India, hasn't had a sort of global release in that sense. Subi, what about you? Was this the first time you were reading a book by a UK author that's been published here? Is it?
It is actually, because the mostly the authors I have read were dealing with the American context. So it was a fresh view also, because one thing that Leonard also mentioned in yesterday's talk, that oftentimes we see that how environment acquires a certain negative connotation because of the climate change problems we have. But then the interesting part of this book was for me that it did not have that a certain pessimistic perspective. And I think that was refreshing for me, because within a country wherein you have this supposed binary that, okay, that's the developed country, this is the developing country, that's this, that's the West, this is the East. This was interesting because mostly because Amita is one character that really tells you that, okay, you know what, we do not have to talk of differences and the negatives, but differences can be something positive that brings together that entire family. So definitely it was a first book for me by a UK author, and as my description said, I definitely enjoyed it.
I'm glad to hear that. But what is of interest to me also is the cultural nuances that you might have noticed while reading this book. I mean, I do have something from both the books that I found very interesting, but I'd like to hear from you about, was there something that because I know somewhere in the Six Spellmakers there's one reference to a British boss that she makes. So I was just wondering if there's something that you picked up on in terms of cultural nuances, or something that you didn't know culturally that. I mean, I know Charlie's spoken about Mumbai and its smells and its sounds, but anything else that either of you, Rebecca and Sarah, might have sort of picked up on?
Something I picked up on that I thought was key to the story. I don't think I'd say it's unique only to India or Mumbai, but the community of living in a building together and how the children came together and thrived on their friendship, and the adults, and really how they influenced each other, they supported each other, and the community was the big thing I noticed. I think community can come in many forms and shapes and sizes. So I don't think would only happen in this context, but that was the big cultural aspect I took from it.
The sort of coming together, that sort of collectivism, are you sort of talking of that, where they're sort of involved in each other's lives?
Involved in each other's lives, living next to each other, which brought conflict, but it also brought community, the way they helped each other in different moments. Yeah, things like that.
Subhi, was there something like that I know you spoke of Amita? I mean, that was something that even I really liked, that she didn't force in somebody from, a person of color just because, well, it's the right thing to do, and towards like a definite agenda of inclusivity, but because it's just part of the community. But was there anything else that you picked up on, Subhi?
I mean, not to mean it in any negative way, but I did pick up on the bully culture that comes into the novel, and for two reasons actually. Because one, it was something that has always disturbed me since my college days. So I was like, okay, this is something that's very personal that's coming into the novel. But the way that Leonard has worked with that bully culture to also say that, bullying is just an act that can disturb any form of life. It's not just the human, but we also see the pigeon getting disturbed by it because of a bully figure. So that was one thing that came across, that, okay, it's also a certain culture that's there amongst the student life, and that's very much there in the school life of UK, and Leonard is engaging with that. But more than that, what interested me is the flip side of it, where when the necessity was there, people came together, all the children, bully, non-bully, good people, bad people, supposedly, all in single quotes, all came together because it was the need of the hour. And that coming together by the end of the novel, one, it was an happy ending, definitely. But more than that, it allowed for a fresh thinking wherein, okay, while bullying can be there as something that is part and parcel of student life, it not necessarily that's all there is to the school life that Leonard has brought me about the UK school life.
It's quite unfortunate, though. I mean, that. But I thought it was dealt with quite sensitively. Sometimes I know that
Definitely.
episodes of bullying, especially because there are many people who might have sort of witnessed it in their lives, can sort of trigger off a landslide of emotions when you're reading and engaging with the text. But just going to the next question I had, both the novels are set in very sort of different worlds, in the sense not just different countries, but also geographically, but also like Twitch is set in a small town, from what I gathered, in the UK, and Six Spellmakers of Dirabji Street is set in this megapolis, Mumbai. It's probably the biggest metropolis in India. So how are the protagonists? I mean, I know the three of you sort of read Six Spellmakers, but engaging with the natural world that exists within this larger megapolis, and how are they interacting with it? Rebecca?
Yeah, I mean, I found that really fascinating in Six Spellmakers, because, we're kind of obviously in this big urban environment, and they're living in an apartment block in close quarters. And I think they describe, playing cricket out on this kind of strip of cement that becomes like this amazing playground for them. But, you're kind of really aware of that urban environment. And yet then we're kind of also asked to look in at the small details, like the bits where nature comes through, like even just in the way the author uses the language. She kind of points out the potted plants outside each of the flats. I think there's one point where she kind of uses, like, she weaves in these natural metaphors. So even when she's talking about things that aren't about of the urban world, you kind of get the sense that there is the urban and the natural world working in sync together. And then obviously you kind of get this garden, which occupies this really important place for the children, as like a place of comfort and safety and friendship, and that really matters to them, that it might not be a big space, And it might not seem much to other people, but to them it's hugely important. And I think the way that that's written about, I felt very connected to that. And I think, especially, I was thinking about recent times, we've been through the pandemic, and people, especially in urban environments, were very confined to their spaces. And yet, I know for me personally, like finding the natural world was the thing that really helped. And so there was something, I know this was written before that, but I think there was something about that was very relatable now for children, that even if you are growing up in an urban environment, you can still find, there's often even small patches of nature there. And I thought this book kind of got into that and explored that really well.
Charlie?
How do I top that? That's a great answer. Really, really good answer. Yeah, I think Rebecca's really hit the nail on the head. Even though it is such a metropolis, it is finding those spaces, and actually the importance of like 2 trees in a space, and how precious it is to protect that. And I think in the wider sort of discussion around the environment, it feels huge. It's like, oh my gosh, how do we save an ocean? How do we save like a forest? It feels so big. And actually what's so brilliant about Six Spellmakers is it can literally start at home, and it can start with 2 trees in a communal space that is a precious thing to be protected, and it is as important to be protected to add to the larger discussion. So yeah, just echoing Rebecca.
So I'm not going to foist this one on Sarah as well. I mean, unless Sarah, you have something.
I can add one thing. The only thing to add for me was the Bimbley trees, and how Nivi and Sarita, they climbed them, and time almost stood still when they were up the trees. And I think it gave permission for imagination. And I thought that was just relatable to me and nature, and my children and nature, and students I've taught and nature. And I really thought that was done well. It was this sacred, special space that everything stopped when they were up there, and anything was possible. Yeah, that's all I have to add.
That's a lovely addition. I'm sorry, we're a bit disbalanced here because but I believe, I mean, what Lexi did tell me was that all 3 of you have also read Twitch.
Yes.
So feel free to sort of make any comparative references. I know Subi, I think because, he's primarily read Twitch. But yeah, I mean, Subi, if there's something that you pick up on about Six Spellmakers, I might have something to say. Just feel free. But yeah, Subi, I mean, to take that question to you, because Twitch is set in a very different space, isn't it? So if you could give your sense of how, the protagonist is interacting, how Twitch is interacting with his location.
Right.
And what did you think of that?
I mean, I would start off with the fact that it was very relatable, because the hometown I come from, Durgapur, that itself is a very small geographical location within the big state of West Bengal. Like, people often forget the fact that there is a town like Durgapur near to the capital, Calcutta. So for me, it was a good locale specific relationship that I was able to build with the novel, that I know that how it feels to be in a small location where you know your neighbors, where you know the aunt just the next door, where you know the newspaper guy, where you know that, okay, there's this park, you can always go there for a sunset view, for bird watching. Interestingly, the park we have in Durgapur, that's good for if someone is interested in snake watching, not so much bird watching. But nevertheless, it's definitely an experience if one has an interest in snakes. Megha knows that I have my personal interests in snakes as such. But other than that, I think when we focus on any small geography as a narrative place, it gives a lot of potential to the narrative, because then you are focusing on the nitty-gritties of the geography. You're focusing on every person then becomes so very important, so very close. But then you also don't want the narrative to make it seem like, oh, it's a very congested geography. No, it's spanned out across the narrative. It's spanned out in a way that you realize that, okay, the place itself keeps coming back into the narrative, almost like there is something about the place that keeps Twitch grounded. There's something about the place that Aves would. It's something that Twitch keeps going back to. It's a location that brought him closer to Jack. It's something where we see the entire climax of the novel coming down to. So definitely these small location. I mean, small has always been very special to me because my own interest with microfaunas, insects, snakes, little bobbles, little birds. So small, I think, oftentimes are underestimated as to what the potential they can have to give
Mhm.
you in terms of the intimate details they can give you. And I think that's one thing that, apart from the fact that I had a personal relationship to go back to while reading the novel, that focus on the small as something that can give you so much as a narrative, as a story, as an entire eco message is
Mm.
something that I found very interesting in the novel.
Mm. So, I mean, just to actually start off from there, both the novels do have this idea of nature as a refuge worth protecting, running through them. And I was wondering if you had any thoughts about, how convincing are this sort of how convincingly has this sort of plot been plotted through the novels, and the sort of struggles that the protagonists go through to sort of keep to that plot point. I mean, how convincing did you find that? I'd go with Sarah, maybe. Yeah.
Sure. I thought they both did it in two different ways. So thinking about Twitch, the bird watching runs through it because Twitch is always learning from the birds, and he uses how he understands birds to understand people, to understand motives. He uses bird calls to help get Jack out of a tight spot. The ending with the murmuration. So it runs in how he understands the world. Whereas in the Six Spellmakers, I thought it worked really well because it was part of the plot. It was literally their activism and their coming together to save the trees was your adventure, and what was happening. So although they were different, I thought they both worked well. But I'm interested to see what other people thought.
Charlie, yeah. What do you think of the whole conjuring of a spell to protect the trees? I'm very interested in what you thought of that.
Ooh, it was really well done because I think what is the magic and what is the magic of writing with Six Spellmakers is they are doing very practical magic, which is really touchable, and all the objects they collect around the building are all connected to the building, and it all feels very tangible, which gives it that element of, is it magic or is it like just their cleverness of coming together? And that in itself is a joy because it doesn't feel like it's not something that you could do. It's like, actually, it is magic, but also this is something that a young reader could actively do, like send an email or write to a newspaper or anything like that, which gives it power and that like element of fantasy. And I really liked the I think the question's sort of answered, but it's not concretely like this was magic and fairies did this. It was like, no, actually it was the children who were very active in creating and saving the space, with the fantasy elements sort of inspiring that. So I thought that was really cleverly done.
Yeah, I thought it was interesting how she kind of wove that almost fairy tale element of the narrative, which I wasn't necessarily expecting for some reason. I knew, the title obviously kind of suggests magic, but I'm not sure as the fairy tale element. I didn't think that would necessarily be there. But then, yeah, how it also becomes a metaphor for the magic of the garden and magic of that space and the refuge. I think that was, really interestingly done.
Okay. Subi, what about you? What do you think of that
Well, I was I was left with thoughts on that question because when I'm thinking of nature as going back for this refuge that we keep finding for Twitch, I was also wondering if this is something to do with that old idea that, okay, there is this unchanged nature and you can go back to, but they're not really. Twitch knows this Aves Wood through and through, and he also knows that it's not a nature that's unchanged or that's this exotic, but rather something that he relates with, and it has its own dynamics. It has its own wilderness and wildness both, to just take from one of the scholars whose name I'm forgetting. Apologies. But yeah, so for me, I think that element where Twitch always knew nature as something that is always wild, that is always something that is not in control by a human, but rather something from which a human can learn, grow, and develop as a character altogether. Because as Sarah rightly said, we do see that Twitch learns from the birds, applies those learning in his own life, and almost makes the interesting part was where he had this has this nest of his and his imagination that, okay, I am the bird inside this nest. That's very interesting because it definitely gave me a good idea for some interior designing work, but B, it was just so fascinating that that you think that, okay, it's something that he knows that it's something outdoor, but then something that also gave him a sense of safety, a sense of refuge. And in passing, we see twice it comes in the novel that, okay, your friends are the ones with feathers. You need human friends also. But he's very okay with the fact that, maybe sometimes friends, that very word itself can have different figures for some different people, and that connotation of refuge in the form of a home, in the form of a friend, in the form of a location itself, these kind of connotations that word evoked in me in the novel, that's something I was thinking about.
Now, that's interesting. So I think what you're and actually that really does because I'm doing my MA in environmental humanities, and actually what you just said, Zubi, does make a lot of sense. I do feel that that sort of dichotomy between human and more than human and nature and culture is sort of more spelt out in Six Spellmakers, where there's, I mean, even though she weaves in natural references through the narrative in Six Spellmakers, there's still a nature and then there's culture. Whereas in Twitch, it's sort of more seamlessly blended together. I mean, even though there is, I don't know. I mean, even though there is this whole idea of Aves Wood, and but the way the protagonists relate to it, I think the dichotomy is a bit more sort of obscure in Twitch compared to Six Spectators, where there's a very sort of clear, this is nature and this is home, sort of thing going on. That's very interesting, Subi. Thank you. But
If I may add one point on
yeah.
the point that the distinction that you made, one thing that is interesting about Ageswood for me was in this game, like I noticed it in my second reading of the novel, that Ageswood is also a reserve, and whenever there's a natural reserve, we often wonder that, okay, there's something at the end of the city, there's something, making a disjunct between nature and culture. But then Twitch is not doing that really. Twitch is actually very organically locating that reserve in the daily lifestyle of the entirety of the town. So again, just to echo the point that you said, that there is this organic blend that's happening, even though we see it's something of a natural reserve. It's not so very disjunct from the daily life of the people, but rather it seems to be there always. Like it's part and parcel of how the town is functioning daily.
Mm. Yeah, it's sort of like blended into the workings of the town in a very interesting way. Yes, I did. I mean, I did. You did make me think of that retrospectively. But I think for the next bit, I'm going to ask each of you to probably do a short reading of a passage or something that you found really interesting from the writing. Things that I'm not sure if you've sort of consulted between the three of you.
No.
If it's passages, but yeah.
What have you guys picked?
I have ones from either book. And I've got two different ones, so I can go with however you go. How about you? Do you want me to say I have? So is this from focusing on Six Spellmakers?
Maybe yes, but
Yeah.
I mean, happy for you to even read something from Twitch, because I know we have only Subi reading from Twitch, so yeah.
Either one. So the first one I had picked was on page 24 to 25.
Mhm.
Is that different from you two? Rebecca and Charlie?
I've picked a bit from the start of chapter 10. I haven't got a page number, I'm afraid, because I was reading on a Kindle.
Same.
It's going to be later than.
Um,
Why don't you go first, Rebecca?
All right. So I'm going to actually, we're going to put you into solo when you read your bits, because we might want to pluck out some of these for our little clips. More than that when we finish the conversation. But yeah, Rebecca, you can start. And can we have Rebecca on solo view, please? Yes. Rebecca, if you could read your bits from Six Spell Makers and maybe just put in a word or two about why this particular bit.
So this is from chapter 10 in the book, which is when the girls are trying to think of ways to save the trees. Nivi and Sarita walked to the taller of the two Bimbli trees. They swung themselves onto the top branches and checked that there were no cottadiers or braganzas about. Then Sarita cleared her throat, sat as straight as a CEO at a board meeting, and started speaking. As you all probably know, she said, patting a branch covered with fresh pale green leaves, some horrible people want to cut our lovely Bimbli trees. We'll do everything we can to stop them, but you will have to help us. We need some magical help to protect our darling trees, please. There was complete silence in the garden. Not a bird chirped, not a butterfly fluttered. Perhaps it was the time of day when birds and butterflies are otherwise occupied, or perhaps it was because every single being in the garden was listening. Then a tiny moss-green sunbird with a creamy yellow belly tweeted. Nivi and Sarita climbed down the tree and headed back home for lunch.
So was there any reason you really liked this bit?
I think maybe it's that quality that Sarah kind of picked on earlier. It's that moment of you feel like you're kind of stepping out of time, and the way that they were listening. They were trying to save the trees in the garden, and it was as if the garden and everything there is listening to them as well. And I just really loved that moment of feeling like, oh yes, we can stop and listen to the world, and the world does kind of listen to us as well. And then there's this moment where you think, oh, maybe nothing's happened. They've just gone off to lunch. But actually, at that point, it kind of kicks into the magical section of the story. And I just really like that as that sort of that pivot point, really.
Okay. Charlie, could we have your reading?
Yes. I'm reading from chapter 4, Sarah. Is that the same as you?
That's the same as me.
Okay.
But you
Sorry,
go. No, you go first. And if it's the same, I picked out 2, and I have something from Twitch, so I will.
Is it when they enter the garden?
It is, because that's beautiful. But you do it.
It's so good. I can pick something else.
No, Charlie, you're up. You go. You do it.
Okay, hold on. I'll probably butcher it because there's lots of wonderful flower names. Okay. So I loved this bit, hopefully, probably for the same reasons as Sarah, that it is the time where we first meet the garden. And you really get, I think I really just clicked with Nivi because Nivi loves fantasy books. And then when she goes into this garden, she's transported. And I've definitely felt that in nature myself, where you're just like, oh my gosh, this is like something from Lord of the Rings or Harry Potter. And I'm in this magical world literally now. So the garden can be entered through a creaky metal gate, almost hidden under the luxuriant leaves and red blossoms of a Madhamulti creeper. Nivi took a deep breath and gave it a tentative push. The gate swung open invitingly. Nivi took a step forward and found herself amidst a confusion of birdsong and colour. There were exuberant bougainvilleas, fat orange ixorias, and cheery yellow alamanders. Pale ferns and bright creepers grew in joyful and chaotic abundance. A couple of trees spread out welcoming branches. 2 beady-eyed bulbuls were perched on the brick wall. Some yellow butterflies floated about. As an avid reader of fantasy books, Nivi had often imagined how it must be to travel 100 years into the future, to be able to turn into a Pegasus, or to cook up thunderstorms. But the fluttery, fizzy feeling that overtook her in this garden was even more magical. It took her a minute to realize that she was just very, very happy.
Oh, yes, that is a lovely bit, isn't it? Sarah.
That is exactly the bit I had picked. You
Good
want
choice.
me- I know, it's so lovely. So my second bit was a little bit on from that, where she climbs the tree for the first time, and I picked it because she's courageous, and it's the spark of their friendship. Do you want me to read that one, or do you want me to read one from Twitch?
I think you could read the one from Six Spellmakers, not a problem.
Lovely.
Yeah.
Okay. So this is also from chapter 4, and I'm on page 26. Nivi says, "Let me try." It took 2 bad minutes and a scraped elbow to get onto the wall. Then came the even scarier bit. Nivi tentatively stood on the wall and grabbed a low branch. But the moment she touched the rough bark, her nervousness vanished. She followed the instructions that rained onto her from above, and all at once she found herself sitting on a high branch. Across from her was a skinny girl with long frizzy hair. She was wearing a strappy white dress, a plum-colored hairband, and a huge welcoming smile. She held out a handful of small fruits that looked unnervingly like green rajmas. "Have a bimbli," the girl offered. "Here, this one is nice and big." Nivi picked up the bimbli and carefully wiped it on her t-shirt. Then she warily bit the fruit, and a sour, mouth-puckering juice squirted out. Both girls laughed and asked each other at the same moment, "How old are you?" They both answered together, "I'm 12. Then they both giggled and started to talk at the same time. And I just loved that as a meeting of two friends. I thought that was really genuine, and it brings nature into it because they're in the tree and the space, and just how much they have in common, and yet they've not established a friendship already. And I loved that moment.
Oh, yes, that's yeah. I mean, I think all of you are reading the bits of the novel that I really like myself, where she's this new kid who's just come into this community, and you know how she learns to be one with them. It's really nice. But we'll go to Sibi now to read his favorite bit from Twitch,
Yeah. So
and also why you like that bit.
yeah, sure. So the chapter I'm reading is Amita's Allotment. This is page 200 in the edition that I'm reading,
Mhm.
and the preface that I can give to this bit is the fact that the seamlessness in which we see that Leonard is making this relationship between the world of the human and the world of the non-human. I think this bit sustains that through and through. This bit not sustains it sort of nails it completely, that entire spirit of the seamless relationship that can be drawn across life forms. So there's the bit where Twitch was upset about Jack, dear protagonist, upset about his friend, and then as we see that he's working in Amita's allotment, helping Amita with her work, and then Amita notices that okay, he's upset about something, and then it goes. No, I mean, I didn't confront him. He doesn't know I overheard. So he had overheard that there's something wrong, and probably Jack has betrayed him. He's under the assumption. But what if he has a perfectly reasonable explanation? He won't. How do you know? It's a dog eat dog world. If you're not at the top of the pecking order, you're at the bottom. What nonsense is this? Amita laughed. When have you ever seen a dog eating another dog? Never, I'll bet. Which was momentarily stunned by this logic. You think I don't know what is going on? She gently cupped his arm. I'm a mother of 2 sons. I know perfectly well what squabbles boys have. People aren't birds, Twitch. They're complicated. They do stupid things. They change their minds. They hurt each other, but it doesn't mean they're not worth understanding. She paused, making sure she had his full attention. Answer me this question. Would you like Jack to be your friend? Twitch wanted to say no, but the truth was he'd enjoyed hanging out with Jack. And it goes. So just to end this section, one of the reasons why it also stayed with me is because uh, a friend of mine was having certain issues with her friend, and I remember when I read this section, I just photographed it and sent it to her and said, "Do talk," because complications happen, but then at times we realize that humans, non-humans, are worth understanding, and things are complicated, but they can always be untangled by a good conversation. So yeah.
Yeah. Okay, I think we can go back to gallery view. Yeah. Well, that's a lovely section as well. I mean, I really like the way um, the authors have sort of reimagined the relationships that we could share with nature in their own ways. But coming back to my questions, do you think young people in your part of the world would be able to relate to these stories? Would Do you think there would be something unusual about these stories? Maybe I'm going to go with Sarah, since you said that you have children, and
Yeah.
I mean, I'd be really interested in knowing if you think that these stories are something they could relate to.
To me, I think children could relate to both books because they speak to hobbies like bird watching and cricket, climbing trees. They both have intergenerational friendships and mentorships, which I think is really realistic for young people. In my classroom, I used to talk about books that we read as mirrors because they reflect back what we know, and books that we read as windows because they show us something that we don't know. And I imagine it just depends on the child. But my young self, the Six Spellmakers would have been a window, seeing something that I didn't know. But even then, I would have related to Nivi's reading. I loved climbing trees as a young person. Nature's really important to me. I would have stood up for it, I hope, for trees being cut down. So I saw moments of mirrors in it, even though it is a different culture and different place than I grew up as an American. So I'm not even English. So yeah, that I do think children today would get a lot out of both books.
Rebecca?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I totally agree with what Sarah said. One thing I really liked, I don't know if it's quite in common, but things about both books I really liked was that sense of justice that you get in Six Spellmakers. And I think that's the thing, especially when you're growing up, when you're a child. Children have a really strong sense of what's right and what's fair, and they want to stand, they don't want to see adults doing stupid things like cutting down trees. That's their special place. And I think that's really relatable for children all over the world. And then in Twitch, one of the things I really liked was that he is willing to be seen, I guess, as a little bit of an eccentric in a way. He thinks people think he's a bit odd because he kind of wants to do the things that he really cares about. But again, I think that's a really relatable thing, because growing up, it's all about like learning about yourself and what you care about and what matters to you, but then also how that relates to your wider world. And that can be a really difficult thing to negotiate. So I thought there was, like, in that sense, Twitch was a great role model for children everywhere. Like, it's great if people might think you're odd because you love birds, but you love birds and that's amazing. And maybe because you love it, you will convince other people as well. So I just think there were some like sort of wider themes in both books that were definitely relatable from whatever culture you come from.
Yeah. Charlie?
I really agree with that, actually. With Twitch, he almost becomes the coolest one because of the fact he sees himself as uncool. It's like, I want to know all the stuff that Twitch knows. This is so exciting. And actually, what's so lovely is for young readers, if you don't know, like I knew nothing about birds at all, and there's not a barrier to that. Twitch is very much like, come and learn it. If you're interested, brilliant. Like, let's learn it together. And I thought that was really, really well done. For me, I think in both of them, there's a very recognizable, either in Six Spellmakers, I grew up in the Midlands, I grew up in Birmingham. I've very much sort of been in an environment that's quite big city. I now live on the outskirts of London, but was in this London, and exactly echoing what Rebecca said earlier, that you can still find special green spaces and what they mean to you as a child. More as a teen, when I was in Birmingham, there was a park in the middle called Pigeon Park, and I would spend every Saturday there. and it was just a stretch of green, and me and my mates would collate there, and like that was just where we hung out. It's always where we were. And so I think there's a joy to that, and I think I hope children still find that and can find special places that mean something to their friends and mean something to them. And I think as a kid you have such a joyous perspective of spaces and the outside world, and I think we can bring friends into that. It builds up memories that you keep with you as a grown-up, and there's just special spaces that you keep always, that really are reflected in this book, in Six Spellmakers and in Twitch, that I think if you spoke to grown-up Twitch, he'd still love Aveswood, and if you spoke to Nivi, she would still remember the Bimley trees. Like, you can just, it's just, yeah, a real memory and a core memory.
Well, Zubi, I think a lot has been spoken about Twitch, but yeah, I mean, I'm just wondering if you had something coming in from, a very Indian reading of that text. Do you think it's something that kids in India would necessarily identify with? Yeah.
I mean, I would say yes, because one might get concerned that, okay, Twitch is set in a different country altogether, it's a different environment altogether, so does it become distant then? But then I would counter argue that it's not the case, because it is that very accessible as a narrative that it brings that place into your study room, into your bedroom, where you're just sitting in a cocoon and you're just reading the book. And that's one. And second, I think more so it's a good read for a child, and I can vouch on it because I myself, I have taken care of so many of my nephews and nieces who read these kind of books, where there's this one character who would be in a corner and who would not want to socialize so much, but then ends up being the limelight of the entire narrative. And that very figure, that it relates to my, at least my nephews and nieces, because some of them are really very introverted. Like, we don't know what to do with the people out there. We have our weird habits. We have habits with making drawings, painting, writing, going out there, enjoying collecting pebbles. So they have these kind of habits, and I think these kind of habits are not something that is country specific, but more like it, like Sarah said, it allows a certain window to open so that different cultures can talk to each other, different children can talk to each other. Twitch, as a child, as someone staying within a certain narrative location, would speak to a child situated in India, or for that matter, any other country.
That's true. I mean, in a way, I mean, obviously, we always say children's books need to be hopeful, and the protagonists are very sort of very life affirming, even though they don't always start off on the best foot. It's really a very nice evolution, I think, in both the narrative arcs. Really build up the characters in a way that, I mean, just to sort of repeat what I said, very life affirming and very sort of like, even if everything seems like it's going wrong, things will improve and will get better in that sense. But actually, the reason I asked this question is because for a very long time, my work in children's publishing, what I was doing was in the business space and with subsidiary rights. And that was part of the work that I did. And I do find that sometimes in publishing, when we read texts that come in from other parts of the world, and I suppose it's true across the spectrum, because I've had sit downs with publishers in other parts, and the way we view texts is, oh, I don't think that children in this country would necessarily relate to, it's too geographically different, or it's too sort of situationally different. So it's amazing how differently we read as readers and how differently we read as sort of, I suppose a part of it is also because there is some sort of monetary element coming into it. But it's really interesting, because I do see how, all of you are trying to sort of look at the texts in terms of what appeals and what might work for everyone. But that's not always how I think in publishing texts I read. So this is really, really great to hear. But I just have two more questions, and I'm going to quickly go through them because I know some of you have to. Rebecca's on holiday, and Sarah has kids to pick up. But mm, do you think the way, I mean, these novels are being told relates to what might be commonly held notions of environmental literature? And, how do you think they contribute to one's understanding of the Anthropocene, geological period when human activities are sort of fiddling with the fate of the planet? Subi, I think I'd start with you because I know you've had a lot of, you've deep dived into Anthropocene as part of your thesis. So,
I see you are testing me now, Megha. But okay, sure. And I would actually because of the kind of question that I was expecting, I did mark a certain section in which last chapter, the pictures, where Tara and her friend is having this argument that okay, whether to join, not to join at the Twitchers Club, and Tara says. Think about all the campaigning we do about climate change, Tara argued. This is a part of that. Climate camping is cool. Bird watching is for geeks. She looked down her nose at Tara. I was fine with the solving a crime thing because it got my photo in the papers and I earned so many new followers. But that doesn't mean I'm about to sit in ditches staring at birds with you guys. No way. But if you care about the planet, you care about the birds, Tara reasoned. And it goes on. And the reason I read this part because while I every time I deal with the question of Anthropocene, it becomes so very serious, so very academic. So coming to Twitch was very refreshing to me because this is where you see that the children are aware that there is something wrong. Children are aware that the environment needs attention, but they also are aware that they are children. And that awareness, the fact that, okay, we are a small bunch of children, we are getting together to make sure that we take care of our birds, our neighbors who are there in our town, that was something of a refreshing, it was a refreshing perspective towards this large, humongous problem of Anthropocene because A, definitely it was something, a non-academic material that I was reading, which was, for starters, refreshing. But B, the fact that a figure of a child can become so very a new perspective towards understanding not just climate change, but the potential of positive response against those forces, against that spirit to exploit environment. It's something new that Leonard has brought to the table. So definitely, and I don't agree to the part where whether it becomes a certain stereotypical environmental literature for the sole fact that something that Leonard said yesterday also during her talk that for her it is not the facts which come in a certain descriptive narrative, but rather how the descriptive narrative is speaking to the imagination of the child, which at least to me it stood out very new because here it's a book which is not talking about facts just, it is not talking about just that certain birds need attention, an environment needs attention, but rather how a child's imagination can bring all of this together, all of this in a nutshell, in a text that also speaks back with that element of child intent.
right.
Mm.
So, yeah, I mean, I'd take that question to all three of you, and whoever wants to go first, I mean, or feels most comfortable going first. I know it's a sort of more academic inquiry into the books, but if either of you want to have a go at it.
I think just Subi, that's such an amazing response. So how do I follow that? But I think that's where Six Spellmakers has a similar thing of giving the power to children, because I think in the sort of narrative of the environment and climate change, every child is aware. Like, we all know that young readers are very aware, and we also know, quite sadly, that they're all quite frightened by it. Like, all the grown-ups are, most of the grown-ups, the sensible grown-ups are, and children are picking up on that, and it's getting an understanding of what you can do, because it feels huge. Like it is across the whole world. We see effect, and it feels huge, and the conversation is always going on, and it feels scary. And with both of the books, Twitch and Six Spellmakers, the characters make it accessible, and the characters making a change accessible. And as we've picked up on, there is that element of hope, and there is that element of the tiny change that you can make to add to the bigger changes that need to happen. And it gives me hope because actually children reading these books will be the ones that change the world. They will be the ones that will take that agency, and hopefully the authors are obviously very active in spreading this message. We as readers, as grown-up readers, are like, this is brilliant, please read it. And then that all comes together as a greater whole to make that change and sort of hold the hands of children and say, yeah, actually, let's all come together and move forward. So I think, yeah, I did not say it as eloquently as Subi at all. But I think it is that the tiny that can make the biggest impact, very much so.
Yeah. So I'm not going to foist any more of the academic discourse on Rebecca and Sarah unless you're interested in saying anything, because we're left with one last question that I have for all of you before we sign off. I think it's just book recommendations that from your countries that you think that others in other geographies. And I know, Sarah, you mentioned that you're from America, not even from the UK. So if you could just sort of leave us with recommendations, maybe not more than 5, but recommendations of books for young people, maybe for adults as well, but that you think would make for good reading in the environmental space for people around the world. I think probably I'll start with you, Sarah, and then go to Rebecca, because I know the two of you are in a slight hurry.
Thank you for accommodating. So my main one that, let me see if I can get it in the, that I wanted to talk about it's called The Marrow Thieves, and it's by Sherry Dimeline. And she is part of the Georgian Bay Métis community in Canada. So she's an Indigenous writer. And this, I love reading in the dystopic genre. So this is a dystopian, apocalyptic story. And people have learned how to harvest dreams from people's bone marrow. And it's from the Indigenous people. And this is a story of found family where different children and some adults have come together because they're all fleeing and escaping. And it's beautifully told. And it is a story of hope, even though it's dystopic. And it very much sheds light on global warming issues, because part of what's pressurizing the flee, I think it's north, is crops and not enough food. So across North America, the people are fleeing. So this is the story that I definitely recommend.
All right. Rebecca?
Yeah, I've got a few recommendations, but I'm afraid I don't have any books with me because I didn't bring very much with me. But the first one is a book called October by a writer called Katja Barnen. Sorry, maybe Charlie's going to recommend that too.
Seconded.
I absolutely love this book. It's kind of one of the most beautiful and moving books I know. And yeah, it's for middle grade readers, really. The story of a girl who lives in the woods with her father off grid. So they live this very, this kind of unique kind of life, really, if compared to lots of children growing up in cities. But when her father has an accident, she actually has to move to the city with her mother. And really, it's kind of the story is about her trying to recapture the magic of the natural world in this urban environment. So it kind of very much speaks to some of the themes that we've been discussing. And it's just so beautifully, it's just such really beautifully written and wonderful descriptions of kind of what it is to be wild, actually, I think, which I really loved. And actually that's made me think of another one, which I didn't write down, but David Almond's book called Bone Music, which is slightly older readers, I think, and that kind of explores the concept of rewilding and rewilding ourselves in a really practical way. Yeah, so those are kind of on a similar theme. Another book that I really love is The Explorer by Katherine Rundell, where it's an adventure in the heart of the Amazon rainforest, 4 children having to kind of, well, like coming face to face with this incredible environment. And I know the author visited the Amazon. You can kind of really tell that all these amazing descriptions of the flora and the fauna, and there's like the beauty and the danger of it, and you know, just an incredibly precious environment, you know, to have this adventure set there. I think that's brilliant. I've got 2 more really quickly. I mentioned Asher and the Spirit Bird, Jasmine de Bilan's book, which again, I think just for the kind of the richness of the environmental, like the sort of the landscape of descriptions that she has, I found that was just really immersive, and I felt very transported there. So love to recommend that. And then this last one is maybe a bit of a left field recommendation, but it's by an author, Lucy Christophers, and it's called Stolen, and it's a YA thriller. So it's kind of a psychological thriller, really, for teenagers, and it's sort of exploring Stockholm syndrome, where so someone has been kidnapped. So in a way, it probably sounds a bit kind of bleak and terrifying, but it's then set in the remotest Australian outback, and the book is just filled with incredible descriptions of the landscape, which I know was kind of part, I think, the point of writing the book is it becomes its own character, and they've really stuck with me. So although it's not necessarily really a book about, you know, like environmental literature in that sense, I think for its appreciation of a landscape, and I haven't read an awful lot which kind of describes British literature describes the Australian landscape like that. I thought it was, well worth it.
No, I mean, I think because we did a module, I know, on eco-criticism, and one of the things that this thinker, Timothy Clark, says that we live in the age of the Anthropocene, where every bit of literature is literature on the environment. I mean, there's aspects of it that are getting woven into, because it's a reality we can't escape. So it's really interesting how he sort of spotted the environmental angles in books that, like Bell Hooks, all about love. In that how she is responding to the consumerist crisis. So it's you know, I think most books would probably explore some facet of that. So just have a go at it in terms of just recommending books that you think are just really great. Yeah, Charlie.
Rebecca
Did I
said
feel
one, but definitely no, it's great. Definitely second October. And I was also going to say Katherine Rundell, and she's also written just a beautiful book called The Golden Mole, which is just sort of studies of nature, and it's just beautiful. Yeah, it's absolutely stunning. And to go left field, just because it pinged in my brain. The Hurting by another Lucy Van Smith. It's another it's a quite a dark YA, but it is set. I googled it when I was like, oh no, I've got no ideas. It's a Nordic noir, and the scenes of the mountains are just stunning. It's a really, again, the environment just sort of stays in your mind, and the starkness of the mountains and how remote and removed the main character is really adds, the environment's a character, and so you're just in that, like, you're feeling the emotions through the mountains. I really, really enjoyed it.
Yeah, thank you. Subi?
Yeah. People have been talking about novels, and I'm guessing a lot of them are fiction. So I would be bringing in one collection of poems, one nonfiction, and one mythology. So I would start with the myth one. Unfortunately, I do not have the physical copy to show you, but it's The Tramp of Snake Goddess by Kesar Huck. So Huck does this beautiful job at translating and also transforming the poetry form of the Manasa Devi legend, which is very popular legend in the Sundarbans of West Bengal, towards the northern side of India, the UP, Haryana, Punjab. And The Tramp of the Snake Goddess is basically an English translation and a prose transformation of that legend, which was first recited as an oral legend, and later it was written down in the form of poetry around 11th century, if I'm correct with my dates. So the Tramp of the Snake Goddess is very simple in language, but it's all the reason why I'm suggesting is this because the character of the snake, again the snake, becomes so very important in this entire narrative that you realize that okay, something as supernatural as the goddess and this natural world, the human, the conflict that's happening in the story, the snake becomes so very significant in making that mediation, oftentimes like as a negotiator, oftentimes as a messenger, oftentimes as telling the human that listen, you have certain limitation, you need to let go of your arrogance. So it's a very crude summary of this piece of this novel, so you can definitely check out. The next one I would be a little academic, giving a non-fiction, but it's something I came across during my research, and it's very recent actually. Shifting lands and moving people. If so, it's the book is talking about the Sundarbans. However, one thing that is very particular about this book, it's a collaborative work between Shamantak Das, Gautam Gupta, and Sujata Hazra. They are all so it's from one of the universities itself that's based in India, Jadavpur University. And the reason why I'm suggesting this, it can be read by a young adult, an adolescent, for the fact that the authors were very conscious of the fact that they are not giving just a factual description of the Sundarbans, but rather a guidebook for anyone who wants to understand the ecosystem of Sundarbans, the ecosystem where the tigers live, but also the people coexisting with the tigers. And interestingly, towards the later part of the book, we find that the climate change and how climate change is affecting this ecosystem is also very lucidly described. There are certain factual details, however, if one can just pass through those 2 3 pages, it's a good nonfiction read because it connects you again. I'm just here taking Shara's praise here, but it does act as a window for anyone who would want to be on the chair and just visit Sundarbans. The next one, the collection of poems that I wanted to bring was Ranjit Hoskote, The Hunch Crows.
Yes.
So luckily, I was able to meet this person at my university. I was able to have a conversation with this person. Uh, I don't know, like to describe this book with any one adjective, I would fail at it because it all it gives you are these moments when you can feel poetry as giving you something positive. So Hoskote knows that we are faced with war, climate change. We are faced with so much of negativity around this world. But then you sit with one piece, and these are surprisingly, these are just like very small pieces there. You just have like page long most of these pieces, but then the conciseness with which Hoskote grabs your attention, it's that because you finish the piece and then you're like, okay, once again, that was so refreshing, that was so positive. And so any child who wants to explore poetry, I would always bring to the classroom Hoskote because of the sole fact that it's a small piece, but you can really sit with it. You can really enjoy the lyrical nature that Hoskote brings to it. That's all from me.
Okay, that's actually Ranjit Hoskote is one of those few. I mean, he won the award. So every year at the Greenlit Fest, we give out we honor 3 green books that were published in the last year. Recommended as honor books, and in terms of how they address the environmental crisis. And Hoskote's collection was on that list in 2022. And he's, of course, one of those poets who sort of managed to break through the national boundaries, and he's been published abroad as well. His poems have been translated. But yeah, that's a really great record. Subi.
I love poetry. Thank you.
Yeah, me too.
He's got two of them. This one I think is the latest one, and then there's another older collection called Jonah Whale, which is
Yes.
Jonah whale, as in WHALE whale. Both of them sort of look into the whole climate crisis, but from a very sort of not forced perspective of, oh, I'm writing a collection of poetry on the environmental crisis. More like tying into human experience and emotion in, and so sort of just smuggling in the message in there. But it's been really nice.
I'm coming right back.
Actually, I feel very sort of liberated when we don't record these things and they don't go on to any sort of immediate public platform, because there's so much of pressure about this whole thing about,
Yeah.
I mean, looking a certain way and being camera ready and yeah.
I'm so sorry.
No, it's all right. I was just telling them that I'm actually very, I like the, sort of informal, casual comfort that comes with just having a chat without worrying about it, being projected for the public. So,
I
but
completely agree.
Yeah.
it's really been very nice chatting with all of you about these
So
books.
nice.
You too.
Me too, definitely. I loved talking with all of you. Thank you.
And
Definitely.
thank you for sparing time on a weekday. I know all of you have different things going on and studies and work and what have you, but really, thank you so much. I think it's been really interesting uh, for us to have this, and I think one of the things that we are sort of very interested in exploring through this is how does one sort of decolonize literature and completely sort of free it from these sort of divisive ways in which we sometimes approach literature, as in literature, this geography or that geography, but find common ground. I'm sure there are sort of things that you liked, and there are things that may have been unusual or critiques that you might have had of the narratives that you read. So that would be really interesting as well to get a sense of. I'm going to I'd like to end this conversation by telling you that how we propose to go forward with this is that in April we're going to start off with posts about uh, the books and the authors, and then of course the little write up and the video that Rebecca and Charlie made, and that was really really fantastic, guys. Thank you so much. Sarah, if you have something that you want to sort of quickly record or something, I'm quite open to that. Just to say that, whatever, you read this book as part of this exchange and you really like this or didn't like this or whatever. You don't always have to flatter people, but yeah, just so we're going to play those, and then we'd sort of publicize the fact that we had this sort of dialogue. And I know that there's a release form that the university has here. I mean, I think I was talking to Alex, and fortunately, I think Indian universities don't have, that sort of paperwork. But essentially, what it means is that we won't be going forward with any publicity material unless we've got your consent on it.
Yeah.
So we're going to be pulling out a few clips from today's conversation, and I'm going to sort of share those clips with you, so that you know that these are the clips that we're going to most probably be definitely sort of be releasing the clips with your readings of the bits that you really like. So hopefully that should not be controversial at all. But I mean, just little bits from the conversation as well. So I'm going to run those past you. And then there's going to be a transcript that we're going to pull out of this, which is like a full length interview. I might want to sort of remove the bits of the readings from that and just sort of focus on the questions. I mean, I just have a think about it. But obviously, I'm going to make a few edits. And sometimes what happens is whatever has been spoken in the video doesn't quite translate right onto the transcript. I mean, it's really odd. I've had some very, very funny conversations where stamps came as scams on my, I was just really weird just reading the script and kept on saying the scams of this, scams of this. When did they ever apply, sort of speak about scams? But anyway, so I tend to be a bit liberal with my editing of transcripts, where I don't, if something's not reading like a proper sentence, I'm just going to turn it into a proper sentence.
That's,
Great.
Don't feel like, oh gosh, did I really say that? I mean, I'm not going to mangle what you said. I'm happy to just, fine tune it, which is one of the perks of not releasing the full video, but actually releasing an edited, neat transcript. And feel
Sounds
free
good.
to, if there's something that struck you as an afterthought that you weren't able to sort of speak about in this sort of dialogue, then feel free to sort of add that into the written transcript that will eventually go onto our website and will be available for anybody who wants to just know about how these different books have been perceived by people from different cultural contexts reading them. And yeah, I mean, I'd be happy for you to stay in touch with me and Subi and between all of you. And if there's things that I think what Lexi did tell me is that on the course, the MA in Writing for Young People, some of you might be sort of developing publishing critiques of these books. I'm not sure. I don't know. There's something, I don't know. I'm probably just I probably didn't quite follow, but she said that besides having this dialogue, you might be using the books for some of your project work. Is that right?
Haven't yet, but I know we've still got a bit more of the publishing module to go, so it might yet come up.
No, it's not as if I'm suggesting you to use it, but yeah, I mean, for the purpose of the dialogue, it'll just essentially be this conversation and that interview where you can add in bits. And if you choose to do something more with the books after that, feel free. If there's something you want to talk about, if you want to know anything about Indian publishing, I'm just like an email away.
Thank you.
So,
Thank you.
any questions about that? It could just be flimsy questions, and so be the same goes for you. I mean, I love to stay in touch with people and just pick people's brains on how things are being perceived. But I won't hold you any longer. We've 10 minutes in, past the hour. So thank you so much. I hope you have a fabulous holiday, Rebecca.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, I'm not going to hold up any of you. It was really nice chatting with you this evening.
Thank you. You were a great host.
Yeah,
Kept it very
thank you.
calm.
Feel very, just
Putting all
really
of us
enjoyable.
together.
Yes.
Oh, thank you so
And
much.
Subi, you're so knowledgeable. I just
Yeah.
want to listen to you tell us
Completely.
things.
Oh.
I feel like I've learned a lot. Thank you so much.
I've been fascinated by the way. I mean, I really like the bits all of you, Subi, Sarah, Rebecca, Charlie, picked up about the books because it was so close to the things that appealed to me when Lexi and I were sort of choosing the pairings for our exchange. So I'm so glad that, the things that I liked about the book that I suggested from India and the potential pairing with the one in the UK, it's just worked so well. So thank you so much. It at least it validates the fact that we could have a good pairing. That's sort of related, but also yes, and do stay in touch. I mean,
Yeah, definitely.
there'll be these little certificates that all of you are going to get at the end of the, because we've
Amazing.
we got a bit of money from the Royal Commonwealth Society for this exchange.
Oh,
Yeah,
Thank
lovely.
you.
Okay.
Doing these little certificates, and so yours are going to make their way to you when I return in September. So
Okay. Shall we?
right. But all of you are very much going to be around, right? Till August, September on
Yes.
Yeah. So all right. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks. Lovely rest of your day. Bye-bye. Bye, Subi. Okay.
Okay, I will stop the recording.